essentially we have three levers: the curriculum, what we teach, how we teach it, instruction, and assessment, how we know they've learned it. For me, everything comes really from the curriculum. You want to have feedback loops that are relatively short. So if you make a mistake, you get immediate feedback and you go, well, there's a sort of reinforcement learning function there where you go, well, I won't do that again.
Welcome to the Flourishing Podcast. I'm Danny Jabra, and I'm the one that's going to bring us the stories and insights currently shaping the education world. Now, if you've ever confidently walked out of a lesson and thought, yep, I've absolutely nailed that, only to return a few days later, maybe even a week later, and you ask a question and the students have all forgotten what you taught them last week, then this might be the conversation for you. Today I'm joined by an internationally renowned expert, currently shaping the world of the science of learning, everything we know about memory and how learning works. It has authored and co-authored How Learning Happens, and more recently, Instructional Illusions, as well as being someone who's made a career out of separating what makes learning and what we think is learning versus what actually is learning. So today, welcome to the podcast, Carl Hendrick.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Now, Carl, no pressure, but I'm hoping everything we discuss today will actually stick for our listeners.
Okay.
Carl, you're originally from Dublin.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not too long ago, that was noted by UNESCO as a city of literature. Yes, I'm not wrong at this point. Would you suggest, as a former English teacher as well, that Dublin has somehow shaped who you've become today?
Yeah, absolutely. Dublin, there's a thing about the Irish where we celebrate songs, poetry, and that I think shaped me a lot. I was interested in the arts, music, literature, and yeah, it's there's a kind of a sensibility to Irishness, which is not to take yourself too seriously. And I feel at home in Australia because of that.
Yeah, we're talking earlier, there's that commonality in language, in culture, and just that abrasive nature to life being very short. And so you're obviously a very busy man, and I'm a huge fan of your monthly dispatches, in which you synthesize a range of current contemporary research, and you make it really palatable. And in some cases, I even sit there and I put it through AI and let it read it aloud to me, so I don't even have to always read it. I'm quite functional like that, but it's such a really useful form of content that I think is shaping so much of what we know in education at the moment, and very easily be accessible through Substack, and anyone can subscribe to that. How on earth do you find the time to do that on a monthly basis, and you're taking in hundreds of papers?
Yeah, so I've been doing that for probably like 15 years, where I've signed up to different, when I was doing my PhD, I signed up for alerts from different research journals and just got into the habit of reading them. And then I created an RSS feed, and that suddenly meant that I was getting, every month I was getting research papers. So I was just, kind of, for my job then it became important to be across the latest research. So I just ended up sort of, and often I think I'll tweet stuff or put stuff out on social media. I'll see something, go, that's interesting, or, take a quote from it, or, put it out there. But it stems from the fact that when I was a teacher, I didn't know any of this. And I was kind of looking for ways in which teachers particularly could, busy teachers could not just be a sort of across the latest research, but what does it mean for practice? What does it mean if you're a teacher? What does these findings about retrieval practice mean? So most of the time what I do is I'll kind of get up in the morning, and now with AI, you can automate a lot of that.
Yep.
So you can use agents. So I have this RSS feed that I've had for 15 years of just like feeds for about 100 different journals. So you put them in a spreadsheet, give it to an agent, and they send you an email going, here's all the latest papers. Yeah. You might be interested in this, you might be interested in that. And then just, you find one that's interesting, read it, see if it's applicable. And that's sort of so if you're doing that every day, you kind of make a note, and pretty much after as you're doing it, it just stacks up into a newsletter, and then you just publish that once a month.
And I suppose you're going to have to set yourself boundaries there as to how much research you're onboarding with and thinking about. I mean, like, does it ever stop?
Yeah, no, it doesn't ever stop. But you can set a bunch of clear filters about the kind of research that you're going to look at.
Yeah, okay.
So you look at the methodology, you look at the findings. Does it build on existing research? Is it done in real classrooms? And once you apply those filters, actually, there's a lot less than you'd think.
Sure. You touched a little bit there about kind of how you use social media as well, and you tweet things out, you engage in educational discourse. And I think one of the things that you're really great at is discussing what you have some issue with, but kind of the why as well. So I think a really important question the audience would like to know is what is your learning style?
Well, it is, I found out recently that you can, for the princely sum of $2,000, you can sign up and be a member of the Institute of Learning Styles. And you can also get the olfactory learner, which is the learner who learns by sense of smell. Learning styles, great fun.
Sure.
Great bunch of lads.
Sure. And we're kind of in the thinking of debunking some of those prior myths. As you mentioned, there's a lot of research now that goes against that.
Yeah.
I suppose, what's the current stance in your
on learning styles?
Yeah, in your book.
Well, learning styles is, the idea is part of what's called the meshing hypothesis, which is that people have different learning styles or preferences for learning, and that we should design instruction to meet the needs of those. So if you're a visual learner, or if you think you're a visual learner, there may be such things as preferences, but the content determines how you should teach it.
Sure.
You're not going to teach geography if you got someone who claims to be an auditory learner by giving them an audio book of a map. You're going to show it to them visually.
Yeah.
Likewise, if you're teaching music, you don't want to give them a visual, summary of things. So the simple rule is that the content determines what you teach. But these are ideas that were sort of de rigueur 15, 20 years ago for a long time. But learning styles emerges from this idea of kind of highly personalized, individualized, a sense of self that's like, it's quite a postmodern thing that came out of the 60s and 70s that was against this kind of authoritarian idea that, you can teach kids in rows or teach, lecture or more traditionalist style.
Sure.
And it really did fit a certain narrative in the 70s.
Yeah.
Which is, look inside yourself, find out who you are.
Feel
and then the world,
satisfied almost with yourself.
This idea that the world needs to adapt to me, rather than I should adapt to the world.
Sure. I mentioned UNESCO earlier, and some of your most recent work has actually been alongside UNESCO for their International Bureau of Education, to make sure I got that right, on responsive teaching, and we can link that in the description as well for anyone that wants to access that. What's kind of led you towards responsive teaching? Why now?
Yeah, great question. So lots of things in education, they're just old ideas kind of rebadged. Formative assessment is written by Dylan William in 98. He writes a pamphlet called Inside the Black Box. And that really is an attempt to distinguish assessment of learning to assessment for learning. And the idea is that assessment or testing should drive instruction. It shouldn't be the kind of end point of learning. It should be something that informs what the teacher does next. And so in a lot of classrooms, you've got a very low signal to noise ratio. The teacher doesn't really know what the kids are learning or not learning. Engagement is a very poor proxy indicator of learning. And so responsive teaching really is about attending to what kids are learning, and then being agile in the moment to sort of shorten those feedback loops and address misconceptions as they emerge. A lot of misconceptions that students have arise after we assume something has been learned. They don't show up, you can get a sense that someone has learned something, and then 2 weeks later, oh, it doesn't sort of work. So it's really about having a kind of verification layer into instruction where you're addressing misconceptions before they turn into something much worse.
Sure. And I think I've heard you mention before that the inclination of time and the impact of time between making a mistake and then learning it was a mistake, but then forgetting why you came to that conclusion in the first place.
You want to have feedback loops that are relatively short.
Sure.
So Robin Hogarth calls this the distinction between a wicked learning environment and a kind learning environment. So on a chessboard, on a tennis court, the feedback loops are very short. So if you make a mistake, you get immediate feedback and you go, well, there's a sort of reinforcement learning function there where you go, well, I won't do that again. But in a classroom, as a teacher, you often don't get any kind of feedback on what you're doing, often, days, weeks, sometimes even years, where as in what you're doing is not having the right impact.
Sure.
So responsive teaching really is about trying to turn up that signal.
Yeah. And that kind of image you've used before of things being recursive rather than linear. You've got a curriculum with this is what students know, it's what we want them to know. It's not like we're going along that line in a straight direction, are we? Things are happening between getting to the end point.
The truth about learning is that it's highly counterintuitive, and many of the sort of proxy indicators of learning are the worst occurrence or the worst indicator of its actual occurrence. So having read something, the feeling, the illusion of competence, having read it, having highlighted it, that's a very bad projection of whether you're going to remember it in a week, 2-3 weeks time. And so again, it's just a hard-coded feature of human cognition.
Sure.
That we're completely deluded about how we learn, how well we've learned it, and how we might learn things again in the future.
Sure. And there's obviously so much evidence that supports that. And I suppose one of the challenges for leaders of schools is translating that from the research and from what we know to actual everyday classroom practice. And there's obviously a number of barriers en route to that. What have you seen that's working around the world? Because you travel all around the world and visit schools and systems all around the world. And what makes those schools or classrooms successful?
There's several things. I mean, some of them are around the particular culture of a school. So if you have, a lot of disadvantaged students, if you have students who are arriving at school with kind of low prior knowledge, if you have students where there's a lot of behavior problems, that's a whole cultural thing. In terms of teacher and their practice, it's a shared knowledge of how learning happens. So a really kind of rigid understanding, it can be limiting if you have a narrow or a rigid, this is how things need to be, and it's not flexible or elastic or adaptive based upon knowledge. That's not good. Getting more specific, I would say checking for understanding is a very powerful lever of learning because it encompasses so many things. It encompasses those cultural things. It's a behavioral tool. It forces a kind of a cognitive engagement for kids in a way that they often don't have to do in a lot of classrooms. And then it informs what the teacher can do next. But essentially, we have three levers. We've the curriculum, what we teach, how we teach it, instruction, and assessment, how we know they've learned it. For me, everything comes really from the curriculum. You can't out-teach a bad curriculum. Christine Council says brilliantly, you can't rose and shine your way into a bad curriculum. And, Bob Dylan puts it best, 3 chords and the truth.
Absolutely. And so I suppose then one thing you do really well is I think you unpack misconceptions really well, lethal mutations. And so even teachers with the best of intentions may sometimes ignore opportunities to respond or may ignore opportunities to best support their students in the classroom. So what are those sort of things that are kind of common ignorances?
Yeah. The number one thing would be checking for understanding by asking kids if they've understood it. Okay, everyone happy with that? Yep. Any questions? They're very bad techniques because invariably kids will usually nod their heads and say, yeah, I understand that. So trying to think about the kinds of questions, the kinds of ways you might unearth things is key. The thing about misconceptions is that kids often have a really coherent misunderstanding, as in it's within its own frames of reference, it completely makes sense. So they can misunderstand words in slightly ways that they conform to one rule, but the actual rule is slightly different. And you see that a lot with languages and words. Unless you're checking for understanding, you're not going to be able to address those. Mm-hmm. And very often for many kids, they're finding out that they don't know something in the exam hall. And that's obviously too late.
Sure. So again, there's that notion that we're aware of this, and teachers with the best of intentions want to rectify that. Do you have any advice then maybe for school leaders that are trying to develop that sort of culture that overcomes that mistaken thinking?
Yeah. I think good leaders create clarity before, accountability. So they'll be super clear about what success looks like, have very clear examples and non-examples. They'll also de-implement things that are not working. So taking things off teachers' plate in order to make room for things that are more effective. For me, I think what I would want from a school leader is that they are across, or at least have a good understanding of how learning happens, so that any decisions that are made are rooted in the science of learning. And I think within a lot of schools, we've come from a model of professional development, which is, a sort of one and done, get a speaker in at the start of the year, and then another one at the next half term. Whereas we're seeing these more models, instructional coaching models, where there's a more conversational, dialogic element, where teachers are working in small pairs, going in and out of each other's classrooms, identifying things that they could be more reflective about. And we'll probably see, much more of that in the future. But also teachers are, they're time poor. So trying to create a space for teachers to really be reflective is what leaders should do.
Sure. And then the knock-on effect of that, I suppose, then, is this real effort to implement some of these techniques that we're referencing here in terms of being responsive. And then how do teachers avoid being too rigid when it comes to this thinking as well? So there's a notion of, okay, I need to ask a question, respond, ask a question, respond. Is there a sort of kind of learning or mentality around how to avoid rigidity?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think this is where a lot of the lethal mutations creeps in. So, where you have a very good body of evidence from laboratory studies, and by the time it's filtered down to the classroom, it's a kind of pale imitation of its former self. So, like, the more rich and deep your understanding of learning, the more you're then able to be agile, you're more able to respond, you're more able to be flexible, you've got a more elastic understanding of how to vary what you're doing. So that there's this idea as well of kind of zones of tolerance. Where does this technique, how much can it bend until it doesn't work at all?
Yep.
And having that kind of fully 3D sort of high resolution understanding of the thing is, I think, what guarantees that, we see that in other practitioners, like a doctor or a surgeon. They'll have such a deep understanding of the context that they're able to be reflective and to adapt to a kind of changing environment.
Yeah.
And the best teachers do that, in my view.
Yeah. And one of the notions you referenced there is this idea of an onus on school leadership teams and leaders to have a really strong knowledge of how learning happens. And it's quite hard when you've got all these competing priorities, and quite often schools now are becoming businesses and competing not only on the front of trying to educate students as well as possible, but also trying to keep the business afloat, and that's a really strong competing priority. What can school leaders do to, I suppose, balance and keep that at the front of mind, that learning is so important. And obviously, it's the most vital part of how any school runs, but also this kind of competing priorities that are hidden beneath, that are kind of getting in the way of enabling that improvement work to happen.
Yeah, I think a really good leader models what it means to think about educate. You know, they're an educator in the fullest sense of the word, as in they're not just a manager. Unfortunately, I think a lot of school leaders are just managers. They're ambitious to get into the role, but they don't have a view on
Sure.
what knowledge should we bestow upon kids and how should we bestow it. Why should kids learn Shakespeare rather than something else? What makes a good citizen? What are we trying to shape here? There are things that for me a leader needs to attend to, and obviously there is the managerial stuff. There's stuff around parent complaints, student discipline, all those kinds of things. But the best leader I ever worked for was someone who was writing books, thinking about education, trying to shape the narrative of education, and it kind of kept you on your toes, and you had to think about it. The worst leaders I have worked with are people who are, as Philip Roth put it, limited people with limitless energy. People who just simply want to be in a leadership position for the sake of being a leader. It's just a true thing that many of the best leaders are reluctant leaders.
Yes.
And so part of me's almost suspicious of someone who's ambitious to be a leader from the off.
Sure. Earlier on, we discussed the notion of learning being recursive. And you've talked in the past about learning being cumulative. What's the relationship there between recursive learning and cumulative learning?
Yeah, very good. So for any domain of knowledge, like teaching is the decomposition of that into units that can be then built up in the mind of a kid. And there is a scope and sequence to that, and there is an ideal order in which that knowledge is put together. So for example, at a rudimentary level, if you learn your times tables and you commit that to memory, then when you're looking at other math problems, your working memory is freed up. You're not having to figure out what 8 times 6 is. Yeah. You're just instinctively able to do it. Same with language and vocabulary. Reading comprehension is not a skill. It's not, you can't be good at reading comprehension by learning a generic strategies like find the main idea. It's knowledge in disguise. That's the cumulative aspect of it. Like good curriculum planning is asking, what is the story here? Stories are psychologically privileged. Mm-hmm. We're kind of made to look at the world in terms of narrative. And so a good curriculum has got a narrative to it. It's got a kind of an order and a structure to it. And good teachers are able to make that come alive in students' minds. The recursive aspect of it is where retrieval comes in, which is that learning occurs in these interstitial moments, these in-between moments. It doesn't happen when you think it does. It's in the forgetting and the remembering and the sort of archaeological digging stuff out of your long-term memory. And so there again, instructional design questions. Yeah. What's the best order in which students can encounter this information? How can it build upon itself? And to the point where thinking becomes almost automatic.
And yeah, I was going to ask you actually, so is there actually a friction then between this idea of cumulative learning and that hierarchy you're referencing there? Is there a problem that needs to be solved there?
Do you mean in the sense of like Bloom's taxonomy?
Yes. Yes.
I think like we've often conflated an ends with a means. So we say, oh, we want independent learners, so let's get them doing independent learning. But the paradox is that independent learning is a very bad way to become an independent learner. And very often the constituent steps towards a desired outcome look very different than the desired outcome. So often there's this paradox: if you have to do something that seems counterintuitive in order to get the outcome, The thing that springs to mind here would be the concept of, vaccination. Like you want to be free from a particular disease, so you take a small amount of the thing you don't want in order to fend it off. This is like Robert Bjork's desirable difficulties framework. In learning, lots of things that feel like you're not learning in the short term actually lead to long-term gain, and vice versa. Sometimes you feel like you're learning loads and you're not really learning anything.
Yeah. My mum used to always say, you're not just given the keys to the car. There's so many barriers to you even getting close to being even the driver's seat of the car.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I hear that from you. And then where does cognitive load theory sit then in terms of, you've mentioned instructional design there, just in terms of that curriculum design, and is it only considered when it comes to lesson implementation, or should we be thinking about cognitive load theory earlier on than that?
Cognitive load theory, and the great success of John Sweller, for me, is that he had a very accurate portrayal of cognitive architecture, and he takes into account the very severe limitations of human cognitive architecture and plans accordingly. And so his central idea really is that minimally guided instruction is very bad for novices because it's just not consistent with human cognitive architecture. And I think it's Dylan William calls it the single most important thing for teachers to know. I don't buy that, but it's certainly a hugely important thing for teachers to know. And it also makes predictions. It's a theory in the best sense of the word, in that it gives us predictions that you can test.
Sure.
Which is unlike constructivism or a lot of more progressive approaches, which are unfalsifiable. Discovery learning is hard to falsify, but if you have a theory, you can then test it. And I think that's a really sort of unsung part of cognitive load theory.
Is there any benefit to students knowing about cognitive load theory? Is there any onus on schools to actually give students that knowledge to enable them to think and learn better, or is that?
I think there's value in teaching them study skills. So there's a set of strategies that if you want to learn something, highlighting and rereading are very poor things to do if you want to remember stuff. Distributed practice and retrieval practice are very powerful levers of learning.
Yep.
So I think it's worth explaining that to kids. But again, if you have a well-designed curriculum and instruction, the kids will ideally learn it without even knowing that. But certainly for the older kids, where they're doing a lot more independent study skills, I think that's certainly a value.
I suppose then you've also got the implication of modern technology on memory. And I suppose, yeah, that consciousness of knowing how modern technology is impacting your thinking and your ability to learn.
Yeah, and obviously AI has a huge bearing on that. I sort of tend to think, like, the history of education technology is a history of very expensive failure. You've had billions invested in ed tech and very little to show for it. But then I also think that, like, learning doesn't care how it happens. It doesn't need to happen in a classroom with a teacher. It just so happens that that's a very efficient way of doing it. But loads of kids are learning stuff in different ways. And so designing instruction and sequencing and knowledge, whether that happens on an app, whether that happens kids watching a video, or whether that whatever, it's just true that if you give a student a phone, they're highly unlikely to learn something from it. But if you give them a laptop and you have a certain set of constraints and conditions on it, then it may be highly likely that they'll learn something.
And so is that kind of a recommendation then? Many schools are already implementing phone bans, and it's quite a common thing here in Victoria in particular. And I know you've written a little bit about that as well. Is there anything else that teachers can be doing that might support against some of those kind of short form video and information overload concerns that are kind of causing this?
Yeah. If you look at the latest research on students and how they're consuming video, there's a couple of interesting findings. One is, and this is probably true of anyone under the age of 30 actually, but certainly true of teenagers. Number one, they're watching short form video they're watching it at 1.25 speed. They're watching it with the sound off and subtitles on. And very often there's a second screen involved. So they're watching on a laptop and there's a phone in their hand and maybe they're using ChatGPT. The chances of learning anything under those conditions are almost zero. Now, having said that, I learned a hell of a lot of stuff from watching documentaries like those old Ken Burns documentaries, Ken Clark's Civilization, and even, David Attenborough documentaries. So we know that you can learn things through video. The medium is not the message, really. We can learn things in a range of different ways. But if you're optimizing for engagement streaks, if you're optimizing for, a lot of social media is optimizing for outrage, clickbait stuff, that's not really going to be good for learning. But I think there's absolutely a way in which you could design learning environments that uses video, that uses retrieval with technology, where kids can learn things. But it's about a set of constraints. Learning happens when there's a set of constraints. Like creativity happens when there's a set of constraints. When you have less to work with than you think, and you've got to be more like, it's, if you look at, say, music today, when we've got an infinite way of creating things, the paradox is that there's nothing which is as creative or as interesting as that period in the 1960s, where you had the Beatles, the Stones, Otis Redding, Marvin Gaye. You had these just a phenomenal period of creativity and innovation, where there was a much more set of constraints. And so, the easier it is to get something, I think often the less interesting it is.
Not necessarily less impactful. It doesn't necessarily reduce the quality of it, I suppose. But yeah,
I'm struggling to think of a band today that you would say will have the same impact that the Beatles will have in 60 years' time. Or in fact, any and take any band from the 1960s. It's hard to think about a band that are going to be as influential.
Sure. It's that kind of been there, done that. That newness has gone as well, I suppose. And
Baudrillard is a good phrase for it. Everything's a copy of a copy of a copy of which we've now lost the original.
Yes.
And I think that, like kids who listen to Ed Sheeran and they don't know who Bob Dylan is, then I don't know what to tell you. Like you're just listening to a kind of counterfeit version of something, It's like it's the much kind of worse version down the line. But that's probably an unpopular view.
Last couple of questions then. So if our teachers, and just try and position ourselves here as the ones that are at the coalface. If I'm a teacher and I've got, let's say, 30 minutes spare next week, and we know that's often a challenge for our teachers to even find those 30 minutes, what would you be recommending that teacher is doing with those 30 minutes to be as useful as possible?
It's entirely dependent on what is being taught. If you're teaching older students, history, literature, something like that, then I would say you need to know what you're teaching in a very rich way. Lee Shulman said that the superpower of teachers is they don't just know the content in one way, they know it in several ways. And a really good teacher has a kind of very kind of broad understanding of what they're teaching, so they can be flexible and try in different ways. So that'd be one thing. If you're teaching kind of younger or earlier students, that's obviously a separate thing. There's a radically different set of skills that's needed there. But I think probably being just reflective about your practice. A very good thing teachers can do is to video themselves teaching, and then either watch with a friend, look at what they were doing. I think that can be obvious. That can be a kind of mirror for professional development that's more powerful than anything else.
Yeah, I did that 2 days ago. Went back into the classroom for the first time in 2 years, and within 3 minutes of watching myself, I was critiquing nearly every single thing I did.
Yeah.
So it's definitely rich in that sense, and I'm sure
it's good to do it with someone else, because you can over shoot. Like we're biased to look at ourselves with horror.
Yes.
But if you have a second person with you, they're not looking at your.
Yeah.
You're looking at how you look, and you're looking at your voice, and you're looking at all
True.
kinds of things. Whereas
very
someone
true.
can just have a more cold look and go, well, what was the wait time in that questioning?
Yeah, we can
And
put
so
that
on
to
so
one side.
Yeah.
Let's focus
Yeah.
on what we need to focus on, right?
Yeah.
Last question then, Carl. And we hear so much from you, and you contribute so much to education, thinking, how we approach learning, how we design learning, curriculum beyond that as well. So really appreciative of all you're doing for education worldwide, Carl. Is there anyone that is having a similar impact on you in how you think? And is anyone inspiring you at the moment?
In education?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very lucky that I get to work with instructional designers, people like Becky Allen, Peps McCrae, Sarah Cottinghat, Zach Rochelle. They're a team of learning scientists that I work with. I'm constantly impressed by, the people that had a big influence on me are people like Dylan William, Paul Kirshner, John Sweller, John Hattie, Doug Carnine. And I'm constantly going back and reading work that they've done and finding new resonances in it.
Sure.
I think like really where everything needs to go now is teachers need to make sense of the science and kind of develop it. But those guys really, I think, in education at least, they really had a huge impact on me.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I'm sure they'll be appreciative hearing that, but also just this notion that being inspired by many, constantly looking to be inspired, I think that's a really kind of admirable state to be in. So really important to keep that up, I'm sure. And so thank you so much for joining us today, Carl.
Thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, I think you're contributing so much, but you do such a great job of translating and synthesizing, which makes the world of teachers and leaders, the world that they exist in, which is so busy and with all those competing priorities, it just makes that a little bit easier. And if you can make anything easier in education, then I think you're doing a great thing. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on the Flourishing podcast. As usual, if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a thumbs up, share this beyond just yourself, give it to your colleagues, give it to some friends. You can even share it with the odd stranger. We're not too picky here. We'd love to get your thoughts as well. If you have any ideas for any future episodes, please send them in. You know the email address now. It's podcast@max.vic.edu.au. Any other suggestions as well in terms of how you want to get on board with our podcast? We have got our school stories up and running, and you'll be able to see that very, very soon. And so until next time, keep flourishing.